I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we're going to be hearing from returning guest Paul Pillar from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's also a 28-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1977 to 2005, and we're going to be talking about a must-pass Senate intelligence bill that is going to further entrench intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Israel and make it so that this can't really be reversed by the executive branch. Section 622 of this bill is our focus, and we'll be discussing it in the conversation to follow. But before we get to that, I need to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener funded. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, be sure to check out the website of my sponsor, Mike Swanson, my one and only sponsor, I should say, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. His newsletter is free. Sign up for it at wallstreetwindow.com right now because it is the best financial and trading newsletter out there. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips, so it's really useful. One more time, wallstreetwindow.com. Sign up for the newsletter. It's free. You won't regret it. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Paul Pillar. Welcome back to Parallax Views, one of my favorite guests. He's extremely knowledgeable. Paul R. Pillar is non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Security Studies of Georgetown University and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is also an associate fellow of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And we're going to be talking about a very, very important article he wrote for Responsible Statecraft magazine entitled, "Senate Wants to Force U.S. to Share Sensitive Intel with Israel." This is about a must-pass bill that Tom Cotton is pushing. How are you doing, Paul?
Fine. Good to be with you.
So take us through this 192-page intelligence authorization bill. You describe it as a must-pass bill, and in particular, you have concerns about Section 622.
Well, the Intelligence Authorization Bill is similar to the Defense Authorization Acts, generally passed every year. And so it's an opportunity for especially the intelligence oversight committees to make any kind of declarations of policy that are a change from previous years. Technically, it's an authorization for funds to be appropriated by the appropriators in other committees, but these bills tend to be vehicles for pursuing other agendas. So having an intelligence authorization bill for the current year or the year that's about to begin, fiscal year that will begin in October, is not at all unusual. But this particular clause, which is way down, well buried in those 192 pages, would be a mandate for the president acting through the Director of National Intelligence and/or, as appropriate, the Secretary of Defense, to share with Israel intelligence and then there's a specified set of topics, which we can simply summarize by saying it covers basically everything that would be of intelligence interest to services in the Middle East. And it specifically, prohibits the president from curtailing, limiting, or suspending or ending any such sharing of intelligence unless he makes a kind of formal declaration that there's a national security reason to suspend or limit such things. And if he's going to do that, he has to submit a report to Congress within 15 days that details, what is no longer being shared and why he's no longer sharing it, and that explores various other implications for national security in the region and so on and so forth. In short, it would be a pretty cumbersome way to try to make an exception to this mandate. But It's quite unusual, if not unprecedented, for Congress to try to legislatively mandate this kind of intelligence sharing, which is ordinarily ordinarily the business of the intelligence agencies, basically to decide for themselves, what kind of liaison relationship they're going to have, because it gets very much into, and we can talk about this some more, the specifics of intelligence collection and sharing, and something that's normally not micromanaged by the legislative branch.
Yeah, I wanted to delve more into that. So, can you describe how these relationships, when it comes to intelligence sharing, how are these managed by intelligence professionals? What's the hierarchy, and why would it be different than what Congress is pushing for?
Okay. Well, liaison with foreign intelligence and security services is a normal and big part of the intelligence business. And it's important to the United States, mainly because, we don't necessarily have the best information or any access to information we would be interested in on many topics on which foreign services are ahead of us. Not that they're inherently better at collecting intelligence, but simply because they have the access. They often, have the contacts, have the language abilities, have the inroads in a particular society, including their own in any given country, that gives them better access and better ability to collect information on a lot of things. And of course, then we have information that would be of interest to the other services. And when I say foreign services, these include foreign intelligence services. I mean, like MI6 in Britain, to name one that everyone knows. Domestic security services, like MI5 in Britain. Uh, and also national police forces. And these don't necessarily have an exact counterpart to us. I mean, we don't have a national police force, even though the FBI is sometimes thought of that way. Nonetheless, in many other countries, such a force has significant responsibilities in collecting information about, say, domestic radicals or terrorists that might be of interest to us as well as to the regime in question. So that process of exchanging information is quite normal. We do have a hierarchy of sorts of relationships that range from very extensive sharing with our closest allies, the countries with whom we have the closest relationships and with whom our interests most overlap, ranging down to the very limited ad hoc exchanges we might have with countries that are more adversaries than allies. So what goes into decisions about exactly what to share and with whom to share? Well, they do include the overall temperature of the political relationship between the United States and the other government. That's certainly part of it, and that's not something the intelligence agencies would determine for themselves. But it gets into a lot of other things, including, what are our collection requirements? What are the kinds of information we need in the part of the world that we're talking about? And what is the ability and willingness of a foreign intelligence service to fill some of those gaps that we can't fill ourselves? Moreover, what sort of quid pro quos might be involved in operational cooperation with foreign services, where our sharing of information is, part of sort of a sweetener that we use to get them to cooperate with us on intelligence collection or other matters. And not least of all is of course the concern about protecting intelligence sources and methods, and you have to consider that as a potential hazard anytime when you're sharing information with another service. So that's what intelligence liaison looks like. And as you can see from my description, much of these criteria that go into shaping a relationship are ones that the intelligence officers who are on the front line dealing with a particular country and foreign services are most apt to be familiar with and probably can make the best judgments, and certainly much better than a member of Congress can.
So, is it possible that Section 622 could actually make it harder, or could it hinder the ability of intelligence professionals to manage intelligence sharing relationships effectively? And does this have bigger consequences for relationships with other intelligence agencies, not just Israel?
Well, it certainly ties the hand of the executive branch and explicitly the president and the people who work for him in terms of being able to ramp up or ramp down this particular relationship, the one with Israel. I mean, if we were displeased with the Israelis, not only for what they might do in terms of, armed operations and so on, but in terms of perhaps not sharing as much information with us as we would hope they would, in which they might restrict for whatever reasons they have. Well, then that might be a very good reason for us to restrict in return. But given that cumbersome procedure I mentioned that's spelled out in this bill for making any kind of exception to the mandate to share things across the board with Israel, that would be very hard to do. So the hands of the president, including future administrations and future presidents, would be tied in that respect. And you mentioned also, possible implications for relations with other countries. That is involved as well in the intelligence liaison business. No one of these relationships exists in isolation. Um, I mentioned we have a kind of a whole hierarchy from our closest allies having lots of things to be shared, down to adversaries where we share very little. Well, there are various kind of rules that govern the management of this kind of hierarchy of relationships. For example, we generally do not share information on, say, country B and share it with country A. If we've got a relationship with country B that is just about as close and similar to the one we have with A, you don't share information on friends with friends, is the way it's sometimes said. So um, you have to consider the relationship we have, whether it's with Israel or with any other state, in that particular context. And in fact, the intelligence community has had a whole staff that's devoted to trying to manage this complex set of relationships, to make sure we don't start doing things like sharing information on friends with friends, which is what we don't want to do. And we keep the hierarchy straight. And we know that people out in the field, including CIA stations, that are having the direct relations with foreign services, are not going beyond what they should be sharing with country X, given the relationships we have with country Y or Z or some of the others. So it is a complex set of relationships, and you can't narrow it down, or you're in danger of having crossed wires and various other problems arising if you just take one relationship, whether it's with Israel or anyone else, and impose a set of mandates without regard to these other relationships.
I also wanted to ask you, and this is only a really brief section of your article, but you note how Section 622 is being considered, this mandate is being considered that would involve congressional micromanagement, essentially, when it comes to intelligence agencies and how they operate with intelligence sharing. At the same time, this is the same Congress that, has basically allowed the president to do whatever he wants with tariff rates and waging war. So, what do you make of that odd inversion where Congress surrendered power, but they're trying to sort of take it here with this 622?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that as an irony, and I guess our explanation is, on the one hand, you have the lobbies and the interests that that basically carry the water for the government of Israel, and this is part of what Section 622 is all about. Whereas the in effect surrendering of legislative powers under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution is a matter of the majority party in Congress simply bowing and submitting to Donald J. Trump. Uh, I mean, it's really that simple, and it's kind of tragic given how inconsistent it is, that we, on the one hand, have a Congress that is not sticking up for its own constitutional responsibilities on things like declaring war and determining tariffs and a number of other Article 1 powers that are specified in the Constitution, but have in effect surrendered that to the president. While here, on the other hand, they are mucking in in detail on a matter that by its very nature, really has to be left to the executive branch and largely to the intelligence agencies.
Now, I want to get into the meat and potatoes of our relationship with Israel and why this Section 622 may be a bit dangerous given how Israel has acted in the past. As you point out, it's sometimes acted as more of an adversary than an ally. And I know that's controversial for some, but I think there's a lot of evidence for that.
Well, in the intelligence business, I would consider somebody an adversary rather than an ally if they commit the hostile act of espionage against us. And that is something that Israel has done in spades. They have a long record of it. In the article, I cite the most celebrated or most best known case, which was Jonathan Pollard, who committed espionage at such a volume in terms of the number and sensitivity of U.S. secrets that he wound up selling to Israel, that it was one of the largest, most damaging disclosures in the history of anti-U.S. espionage. And I point out further that although he liked to say he was concerned mainly with the security of Israel, he actually offered his services to sell secrets to a number of other countries as well. Um, and that has not stopped. In fact, we've had a couple of uh, press reports about this just in the last week or so about how the Israeli intelligence collection effort, espionage effort, let's be blunt about it, against the United States has, if anything, intensified in recent weeks, apparently mostly in response to the differences between the U.S. and Israeli governments with regard to handling the war in Iran, which simply stated, on the one hand, President Trump is trying to extract himself and the nation from what has turned out to be a very ineffective and unpopular war. But on the other hand, the Netanyahu government wants to continue the war. And they're doing what they can to sabotage it with things like attacks in Lebanon. And so the Israelis in particular appear to have a very strong appetite for collecting intelligence through whatever means, technical or espionage means, about the thinking inside the Trump administration and among senior U.S. officials. I cite one journalistic report that quotes a U.S. official as saying that this recent Israeli espionage directed against senior Trump administration officials has become so aggressive it's now unhinged. Um, so it's a continuing problem. And in terms of who's an adversary and who's an ally in intelligence business, I think that history sums things up pretty well.
Just to go back to Pollard real quick, because I have younger listeners that maybe only vaguely remember the Pollard affair. I don't think we can put too much of a fine point on the fact that that whole affair could have gotten, you know, people killed with the type of information he shared.
Yeah, well, we should. This goes way back to the 1980s during the Reagan administration. Pollard was he was working in naval intelligence, but I mean he had a security clearance and had access to all kinds of secret material related to especially U.S. military affairs. And he just sold as much of this as he possibly could that he could get his hands on. And he was able to get his hands on an awful lot, going beyond his immediate duties. But simply because he had a clearance, he could access a lot of other things. Um, and I quote in the article, then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, when he was submitting a statement at Pollard's sentencing hearing, that it was hard to imagine a greater blow to U.S. security than this particular espionage at Pollard. He was given a long prison sentence that he completed in 2015 and then was restricted on parole here in the United States for another 5 years. In 2020, he was finally allowed to travel. He immediately went to Israel, where he was given a hero's welcome, led by none other than Prime Minister Netanyahu as he arrived at Ben Gurion Airport.
Now, in regards to concerns with 622, is the concern primarily that Israel could collect intelligence against the United States, or is it that information shared by the U.S. could be passed on to other countries that we may be have adversarial relationships with?
The the concern is what is being done with the information, and it's partly what Israel itself might do in terms of its own attacks and operations that are contrary to U.S. interests, but it's also very much the danger of it being passed to other countries. And here again, the Israelis do have a long record of this, and we can just go back to the Pollard case. It appears that the Israelis used some of the U.S. secrets that Pollard stole to pass on to the Soviet Union, as it then existed, in return for getting Moscow to permit more immigration of Soviet Jews. The Israelis have also had extensive technical relations with the likes of the Chinese, which they still do, and they try to maintain a pretty cordial relationship with the Russians, which, the exact boundaries of which are unclear, but we can't assume that they're going to be restricted with regard to information sharing there as well. And you have to understand, the government of Israel, very hungry, especially for having diplomatic relations with countries that have not yet taken that step and established diplomatic relations, have a very strong incentive to use whatever bargaining chips they've got to get such cooperation from a foreign government, or in the case of ones where they already have diplomatic relations, like the Chinese and the Russians, to get whatever other cooperation they want from them, whether it's favorable votes in the UN or other kinds of technical or military cooperation. And so the temptation for them to use information that they got passed to them, that they have acquired through either clandestine or through legitimate liaison means from the United States, as bargaining chips in these other relationships it has, is very, very high. And I think that's a major risk that has to be taken into account.
Can you talk a little bit about another aspect of the article I found really interesting and important was the way in which Israeli and U.S. national interests are diverging, and I think it's an important point to bring up because I've had listeners say to me, well, the U.S. would be doing what it does even without Israeli lobby influence. And I don't necessarily agree with that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the importance of looking at the diverging interests of Israel and the U.S.
Well, I think some of the divergent ones are extremely obvious. The one that immediately comes to mind is continuing to subjugate the Palestinian nation, to occupy Palestinian territory, to do everything they can to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, and to use military force in whatever brutal or inhumane way they might, as we've seen in the Gaza Strip over the last 3 years. None of that is at all in U.S. interest. It is very contrary to U.S. interest because the U.S. gets not only because we have a concern about inhumane actions and general instability in the region, but also because given the close relationship and what is seen as a very close relationship between the United States and Israel, we get blamed for those things and share in the opprobrium in the eyes of much of the rest of the world, which works very much to the disadvantage of the United States. And then you have, other specifics. Look what's going on right now with regard to the Iran war and efforts to end it, and what's going on in Lebanon. As I mentioned, President Trump, unsurprisingly, is trying to extract himself and us from this war. So what is Netanyahu and his government doing? Doing everything they can to sabotage diplomacy aimed at ending that war. And one of the ways they're doing it is by continuing a major brutal offensive in Lebanon, which has displaced about 1 million people and killed thousands. That is a problem in itself with regard to interest in Lebanon and interest of peace and security. But the more specific, immediate thing for the United States is that is one of the main things that has prevented us from getting out of this difficult war in Iran, because the Iranians, unsurprisingly, are saying we're not going to have any kind of partial ceasefire. We want a complete ceasefire, an end of hostilities, and that includes an end to Israeli operations in Lebanon. So it's a clear, direct conflict of interest, which was underscored by the fact that reportedly just a week or so ago, Trump and Netanyahu had a bitter phone conversation, which broke down into expletives because the differences in our two national interests are so great. I mean, here I should be careful. You know, what Donald Trump wants is not necessarily in U.S. national interest, but in this particular case, you know, bringing this war in Iran to an end and reopening the Strait of Hormuz, that is very much in the U.S. interest and world interest, as well as in Mr. Trump's interest.
If you could, can you tie this into the bill that is going through the House right now, the 2027 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act? I think it was Section 224. How important is it to look at both of these together? And do you think that people are maybe focusing on one more so than the other? I feel like this Section 622 in the Senate is not being talked about enough.
Yes, these the two things that you mentioned are both part of a kind of a new strategy in Israeli-U.S. relations as far as the Israeli government and its supporters in this country are concerned. And the political background to this is what you can see glaringly in opinion poll numbers that the public support in the United States for Israel in general has dropped precipitously over the last, especially the last couple of years, mainly in response, of course, to the awful events in Gaza, but other things as well. And so, recognizing this, the $3.8 billion, and it's actually been more than that in recent years, of U.S. Financial gifts, mainly in the form of military aid to Israel, are becoming less and less popular. And Netanyahu himself recognizes this, and he has said, well, maybe it's time for us to phase out that military grant aid from the United States, which it should have done. We should have done long ago, since Israel is one of the more prosperous countries in the world, and they could pay for this themselves, and that's been the case for quite some time. But the strategy here, from the standpoint of Israel and supporters, is uh, phase out the highly visible grant aid with its big price tag, which over the years has come totaled more than $300 billion, but continue to have the United States tied to Israel in less visible ways, ways that are less publicly apparent and less subject to public accountability than a straightforward vote in Congress about grant aid would be. And so the Section 224 in the Defense Authorization Act that you mentioned provides for deeper mandating deeper integration in military technology and development between Israel and the United States in a way that's going to keep the U.S. basically wedded to the Israeli military establishment, even if the U.S. stops paying that 3.8 billion a year in grant aid. And there would still be, although in a less publicly accountable way, the U.S. tied to many of the actions that the Israelis do. Well, this Section 622 in the intelligence bill is basically continuing that same strategy of keeping the U.S. tied to Israel, maintaining big U.S. support for Israel, but in ways that's not subject to a publicly apparent up or down vote on grant aid. And in fact, when we talk about the intelligence sharing, that's an even less visible area than the military technology one. And on the relative public attention, I think it's fair to say, as you intimated in your question, that this provision in the intelligence bill, so far at least, has received even less attention than the military technology provision in the Defense Authorization Act. Both of these are still currently bills, one in the Senate, one in the House in the case of the NDAA. And so they aren't enacted yet, but they are part of basically the same strategy.
I also wanted to ask you, what are the long-term consequences if Section 622 of this intelligence bill goes through? Because this won't just affect the way it won't just tie President Trump's hands. This would prevent future administrations as well, correct?
That's right. Unless it gets rescinded in some new legislation, which would be very difficult to pass, by the way, because anything that would be seen as cutting back on support for or cooperation with Israel, you'd immediately have people on the other side saying, this is anti-Israeli, and you don't want, Israeli security.
You mean
But
like the Israel lobby? It's sort of, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, um, but right, this isn't just the Trump administration. We could have a very different administration with a very different orientation with regard to events in the Middle East and Israel. But that president and that administration's hands would be tied if this provision is turned into law.
Do you see this as tying into some of your previous work? What I mean by that is you've often shown a concern about the politicization of intelligence. Do you see this as part of that with I would assume this is being pushed by Tom Cotton, so I would assume there's a sort of a Israel lobby influence pushing for this.
Well, clearly there is. I mean, this is different from politicizing intelligence in the way I've discussed it in various fora in the past, in the sense of using cherry picking or some other means to try to slant what the intelligence is saying or implying. But it is politicization in the sense that there is a political and ideological um, uh, agenda, which is basically the pro-Israeli Israel lobby agenda that is supporting this. That is not it's not undertaken from the standpoint of what would be best for U.S. security. And I should note, there's nothing in this provision, despite all the specifics that tie the hands of the president and the administration, and having to make justifications if they curtail support. There's nothing that I could see in it that says anything about the requirement for what Israel needs to share with us. and so that's the first question that ought to be asked about, is an intelligence sharing relationship in U.S. interest? Well, it's, what are we getting out of it? And as I mentioned in my earlier description of intelligence liaison relations, that's what motivates these things for the most part from the U.S. point of view, that a foreign service has information, has access to the kinds of information that may be difficult for us to get. Now, there's no question that Israel, with a very capable set of intelligence and security services, has a lot of information that potentially, at least, would be of use to us. But are they going to be willing to share it? Or my answer to that question is, I think that there's going to be no equivalent to Section 622 that's going to be passed by the Knesset. And so the Israeli government will be quite free to ramp up or ramp down what they share with us, while seeing that our hands, or our president's hands, are tied in the other direction. So that will be very much to their advantage and the disadvantage of the United States.
For listeners, so I know that you're uh, a veteran of the CIA, served 28 years. For people that are outside of that intelligence world, uh, how would you explain your concerns to them in a way that may translate for a more lay audience?
Well, I mean, my concern first and foremost is the security and well-being of the United States and American citizens. And that's really what the whole intelligence business is about. It's not for people like me when I was in the service, to have some kind of personal satisfaction in dealing with interesting, secret reports. That's all a waste unless it ultimately translates into, somehow it protects and advances the interests of the United States and the security and well-being of Americans. So when you stick in some other kind of agenda, whether it's a lobby-supported effort to advance the objectives of some foreign government, or any other kind of objective, ones that have more to do with domestic culture wars, or you name it, then you are detracting from what is the overriding fundamental mission of the intelligence community and the agencies that are part of it, which is to do everything it can to protect and advance the security and well-being of the American public.
How important for it was it for you to point out the way in which Israel has shared U.S. origin military technology with China and how that's been an issue? And also, you mentioned the relationship with South Africa. So this goes even beyond the issues that you mentioned with Pollard, but I wanted you to briefly touch on those.
Yeah, well, I'll connect it to what I just said, that it is against the security and well-being of the United States for information that can assist the military capabilities and operations of adversarial countries. And so we don't want to do anything that is going to advance that. We don't want to do something that indirectly is going to say put in the hands of the Russians or the Chinese the kind of information that would either assist the Russians to ramp up the Ukrainian war and perhaps pose a greater threat to NATO countries. We don't want to do anything that might assist the Chinese in their ability to achieve, military domination in the Pacific East Asian area and increase the chance of that they're going to try to invade Taiwan or anything like that. Not all of that sort of thing would be very much against U.S. interests. And so we got to be careful not to do something that would have those results.
I hope this isn't I hope it's not a dumb question, but I was wondering, are there any scenarios that came to mind when you were reading Section 622 that concerned you? Did you think, well, this could happen if this becomes law?
Well, I think it's the things that we were just talking about. Um, I mean, take China, which we often, in most contexts these days, consider our most capable adversary of most concern. More so these days than Russia even. Um, I think it is given the nature of the Israeli-Chinese relationship, which, as I mentioned, has extended to, technical, militarily related technological cooperation. I can easily envision um, information that we shared that would get in the hands of the Chinese via the Israelis because the Israelis would use it as part of their material they would bring to the table in any kind of negotiations or bargaining they're doing with the Chinese in return for whatever it is they want from the Chinese, again, which could be, more technical cooperation, diplomatic support, or turning a blind eye more so than they might otherwise do to Israeli depredations in the Middle East, whatever. There are plenty of reasons they would want, cooperation and assistance from the likes of the Chinese. That would be a specific that immediately comes to mind.
If you had one message for my listeners about this provision that's buried in an intelligence bill, that, like you said, it's one of these like must-pass bills. What would the message be that you want my listeners to understand? And I want to know, I have listeners that are on both the left and the right. So what do you want both sort of sides of the political spectrum listening to this conversation? What do you want them to understand the most?
I would hope that each side of your spectrum of listeners would agree with what I said a couple of minutes ago about the ultimate purpose of what we do in the intelligence business. It ultimately is about the security and well-being of the American people and the interests of the United States, and that goes far beyond anything that's on the left or on the right. And any agenda that interferes with the performance of that mission, whether the agenda is one identified more with the right or more identified with the left, that is going to detract from the ability of our agencies to perform their mission in pursuit of advancing U.S. security and well-being. And so I think that's something that goes beyond any ideological identification. And I hope that would be the message that would be getting across.
And before we close out, is there anything that I missed that you think is especially worth noting? I hope my questions were illuminating.
No, I think you covered the ground pretty much. I mean, this is this is not one of the areas that, by its very nature, gets a lot of public attention. Of course, when we talk about intelligence getting public attention, it's usually the sexy stuff of some, neat spy case or something. We talked a little bit about spy cases, but I think the more fundamental need to uphold the integrity of an operation like what an intelligence agency does in pursuit of its basic mission is most important, and everything we've just talked about basically feeds into that.
And are you hopeful that that there may be pushback against Section 622? I know that's like a speculative question, but I'm curious. Are you hopeful that lawmakers will start thinking about this more?
Um, I'm not real optimistic that this is going to be amended out of the current bill. I mean, it's like so many things related to Israel. Will immediately get defined as, are you for or against the security of Israel? And that's unfortunate, because I could say, even despite all the critical things that I've said now and in the past about many aspects of Israeli policies and practices, having a secure Israeli state is in U.S. interests. That does not imply, subjugation of the Palestinians that are attacking in Lebanon or many other things, which, if anything, work against Israeli security. But that's the way it gets defined. And so on an issue like this, if it, say, came up to a vote either in the committee or a floor vote in the Senate as to whether to keep or excise this, I'm not optimistic about what the result would be.
Real quick, since you brought that up, I promise to let you go after this. Is you mentioned that Israeli security can matter for U.S. national interests, but the ways in which we're entrenching the relationship, the special relationship, may actually be hurting not just the U.S. but also Israel. Can you elaborate on that just briefly?
Oh, sure. And I think, well, and my friend Steve Wald at Harvard has elaborated on this quite eloquently, that people who call themselves a friend of Israel because they defend whatever it is that the Israeli government is doing, whether it's in the Gaza Strip or Lebanon or anywhere else, are not really friends of Israel if your objective is to have peace and well-being for the citizens of Israel over the long term, because that's not what they're getting right now. What they're getting is endless warfare. They're getting ostracism by the international community for obvious and very understandable reasons. I think if the objectionable aspects of the policy, the ones that involve trying to suppress another nationality, the ones that involve starting more wars in the Middle East than any other country, that is not providing for Israeli security in the long run, and it's more of a tragedy than a benefit for Israeli citizens, Jewish as well as non-Jewish citizens of Israel, because it means forever war rather than peace and well-being.
And on our end, it's undermining the image of the U.S. across the world.
It certainly is, and it is. As I mentioned, we share by guilt by association many of the things that involve opprobrium over Israeli actions.
Well, hey, Paul, I want to thank you so much for giving me this time and speaking about this important issue. I'm hoping more people take notice of it. Thank you again. And how can my listeners keep up with your work? You just Responsible Statecraft, your articles are on there?
Yes, and sometimes I write at the National Interest.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming back on Parallax Views.
Okay, you're welcome.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.